Greetings from St. Stephen's Episcopal Church and Blessed Easter. Jesus has two messages for the startled women who arrive at the tomb early on Easter morning that I think are important for us to hear on this particular weekend. Do not be afraid, and meet me in Galilee. First, do not be afraid. Actually, it was the angel who first said this to the women. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary arrived at Jesus' tomb early in the morning after Sabbath ended. Other gospel accounts tell us that they had come to anoint Jesus' body with spices. But upon their arrival, everything comes loose. There is an earthquake, and an angel appears in blinding light. The guards appointed to watch the tomb to keep someone from stealing Jesus' body and faking a resurrection faint away from fear. The stone ceiling tomb is rolled away. All that would be enough to terrify anyone, so the terrifying angel says to the women, do not be afraid. Now, angels do not make frequent appearances in the gospel story. In fact, they only appear in Matthew at the birth of Jesus, at his temptation in the wilderness, and now at the tomb on Easter morning. And the thing is, whenever angels appear and they evoke terror. So the first words they always say is, do not be afraid. And in this case, the appearance of the angel is accompanied by an earthquake, which, of course, also evokes terror. So Matthew's main point here is that there is no way to speak about the resurrection consistent with the way we understand nature to work. When God breaks into human events and fundamentally changes the way that we understand the world to work, the effect is to fill us with terror. In the midst of this, the angels greet the women saying, do not be afraid. Later, the resurrected Christ also meets the women and again says to them, do not fear. So I wonder, when was the last time someone said something like that to you and you believed them? Now, I don't know what it is you're feeling this weekend as the first wave of the pandemic reaches its peak. I've heard some people say that they are enjoying this period of isolation as an opportunity to work on home projects, to read and to reflect. I know that students are feeling disconnected now that schools will remain closed for the rest of the school year. Seniors are missing proms, spring sports are canceled, music performances and competitions will not happen, and graduation has been canceled as well. Meanwhile, the stay-at-home order is causing extreme disruption in the lives of many who have lost their jobs, who are struggling to pay bills and find food for their families. The impact is worst for those who are homeless already, or for refugees who have not yet received work permits, or for undocumented immigrants who will not receive government assistance. And we know that the virus continues to spread, infecting more of our family and friends. A colleague died of the virus this week. A brother of one of our congregation is on the USS Theodore Roosevelt in the midst of an outbreak. A son of one of our congregation is in Queens at the center of the most deadly outbreak in the nation. And doctors and nurses and janitorial staff and grocery workers and first responders are in the front line exposed to the virus every day. So you might be feeling terrified, or angry, or disoriented, or just sad, or perhaps even bored with all the isolation and waiting. So when you were a child, and thunder and lightning was crashing around you, filling you with terror, perhaps your parents hugged you and told you not to be afraid, and you probably believed them. But as adults, when the world is going crazy all around us, it is more difficult to be reassured. As adults, we live in an ever-increasing sense that death is real, that claiming everyone we love, and that bad things happen, and there's nothing we can do but dread it. A few years ago, a colleague of mine from a rural congregation in this diocese asked me to visit a member of her church who was in the hospital here in Spokane. He'd gone in for a surgery, but unexpectedly ended up, after the surgery, in the intensive care unit. When I entered the ICU to visit him, I encountered someone who was terrified. Recovery from surgery had not gone well, so we woke up to find a tube down his throat and a machine helping him breathe. He was unable to speak, but his eyes spoke for him, a terrible fear about what was to come. I wanted to tell him, do not be afraid, but I really had no idea what was in store for him. Not even doctors really had the authority to say, do not be afraid. They do not know the future. They cannot accompany the patient down every path that might happen. Ultimately, I could only say that God loved him, and that God was with him, and that God would continue to be with him no matter what. When the angel says, do not be afraid, or when Jesus says, fear not, it is not to announce that nothing will ever go wrong, because things will inevitably go wrong. It is not assurance that everything will always turn out for the best, because if we are honest, we know that it often does not always turn out for the best. Rather, it is assurance that whatever may happen to us, whatever we may face, God has the power to strengthen us and uphold us and accompany us. It is an assurance that whatever we face, we do not face it alone, that nothing we encounter is stronger than God's love, that ultimately God gets the last word, and that in the end, and usually well before the end, God's love is triumphant. Only God can offer that reassurance, and that is why in the end, only God or one of God's messengers can say, do not be afraid, with authority. So the women arrive at the tomb only to find that the tomb was empty. Jesus had been raised from the dead. Now, the empty tomb is not the main part of the story, but it is an essential part. Without the empty tomb, the resurrection would be just another story of goodness, somehow outlasting and overcoming evil. Such a hope is only as powerful as the most recent experience of good hanging on against evil. But there's just too much evidence to the contrary to keep hope alive in most of us. The empty tomb, on the other hand, shows us that despite all evidence in the history of humanity of hurt and harm holding forth against healing and wholeness, God has acted decisively to overcome that hurt and harm. Life has won out against death. No one has stolen the body of Jesus. There's no dark conspiracy at work here. God has acted, and love and life have triumphed over death and despair. So the women run with fear and great joy back to the disciples, and on their way they encounter the risen Lord himself. And Jesus tells them again, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me. Jesus promised that though the sheep would be scattered, he would gather them again together in Galilee. So the second message for us to hear from this story today is the resurrected Jesus telling the women to tell the other disciples to meet him in Galilee. Because Galilee was where Jesus lived out his ministry, proclaiming and embodying the reign of God. Galilee was where he called the disciples, taught the crowds, healed the sick, fed the multitudes, blessed the children, comforted the oppressed. Galilee was where it all began when the first disciples first met Jesus. Galilee was back home. Galilee was with their jobs, with their families, with their everyday lives. Galilee is the place where they had fled following the crucifixion when their world seemed to come to an end. And Galilee for us is life before the pandemic. But we know that our world will never be the same again. So Galilee for us now is our uncertain future. And Jesus has gone ahead of us into Galilee and will meet us there. Jesus will meet us in the emergency room and in the ICU, in the nursing home and the grocery store, in the jail and the homeless shelter. Jesus will meet us through every step of this pandemic, in the moment of our greatest weakness and in the moment of our greatest strength. Jesus has gone ahead of us through the whole course of the pandemic and will meet us whenever we look for him. Jesus is not in the tomb. Christ has risen. The women run from the tomb in fear and great joy to meet the disciples. Faith arose from an empty tomb. They encountered their risen Lord and were running to share the good news. This is the good news that we have received 20 centuries later. God has conquered fear and death. Jesus' message of love and hope and reconciliation has been entrusted to us. Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ has gone ahead of us, and Jesus is inviting us to the banquet to celebrate his victory over death and the grave. Now, I know that we may not feel so much like celebrating now that the world is turned upside down in the grip of this pandemic, while people around the world are suffering in so many ways. But when we go back to the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, we hear again the message that the angel has been giving to us. Do not be afraid. God is with us. Life triumphs over death. Christ has gone ahead of us. Jesus is present with us in every joy and danger. In the story, the women run to tell the disciples, and the story continues with us. Jesus is alive. Faith and hope have arisen from an empty tomb. God has conquered death and the grave. God is here. Love wins. And we are witnesses to this great news. Do not be afraid. Christ has gone before us into Galilee and will meet us wherever we look for him.